GLOBIS.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. It is my great pleasure and even honor to be a moderator of this exciting session. However, Horizon is always very demanding. The title is very difficult. Sustainable innovation in such a difficult world. But anyway, I'm very happy to welcome three excellent panelists here. Well, Miyako Nakabayashi, Miyako-san, ladies first of all. She's a professor of political science at Waseda University, and she's an honorary fellow of the Mansfield Foundation also. And she used to work for the Lower House Budget Committee in Washington, D.C. as a staff member for a long time. She's a specialist of the U.S. politics. I'm very excited about your participation. And famous Taro Kono, Taro-san, and he is now currently the Minister of Defense, and he is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs. And also in Abe government, she used to be a chairman of the National Safety Commission, Koka-Koan-Incho. So as it described, she is a specialist of the security-related issue. And also, many Japanese people are now expecting that he will become the prime minister in the future. This is I'm sorry, this is just a footnote type of information. And finally, welcome Dr. John Chipman. John is the Director General of IISS. IISS, International Institute for Strategic Studies. This is a very special research institute and established research institute focusing the geopolitical analysis in the global society. And very interestingly, he is the real founder and host of the very famous Shangri-La Dialogue. Shangri-La Dialogue is every year held in Singapore, focusing the security issue. And he's playing a very important role. And additionally, he now decided to establish Japan chair in IISS, focusing the security analysis in this region. And of course, the Japanese government is supporting this establishment of Japan chair very strongly. So we now have a very special analyst. Yoshito-san is very demanding. As a chairman also, I'm also very demanding on them. Well, first of all, Taro-san, I'd like to mention how you see the US-China confrontation. What will happen to Korea-Japan relations? In what way Japan can contribute to the development of the so-called the opportunity of fourth industrial revolution? And John, I'd like to describe the European perspective on China-US confrontation. Also, he's a very specialist of the analyst of the Middle East. According to the front page of Nikkei newspaper, the oil production of Saudi Arabia is amazingly reducing, reflecting the Iranian problem. So I'd like to mention a little bit about that. And Miyako-san, I'd like to, of course, describe what will happen in the U.S. politics. Can you have some predictions who will win in the presidential election, etc., etc.? Let's forget about that. But anyway, I'm also demanding. However, the audience will be more demanding than I expect. So, Taro-san, could you kindly kick off the discussion?
Hi, good morning. I used to be known as Taro Kono, foreign minister. Now I'm defense minister, and we are changing how we call ourselves in English differently. So I'm officially Kono Taro, defense minister. Since the end of the World War II, the United States share a lot of burden to keep the international organization or international regime, international institutions. And well, within the framework of those international institutions, many countries have developed economy and enjoyed the prosperity. Now, Japan, Germany, Western Europe, Canada, Australia, and even other emerging economies growing, the relative strength of the United States has been diminishing, and I think it's natural. So I think it's time for us to share a little bit bigger burden to keep this international order going. That's the first thing. So what should Japan do, or what could Japan do, is something we need to answer. And some people say the rise of China. Well, if you are living in East Asia, you know for the last 4,000 years, China has been the dominant country. And it might have been sleeping for about a century, but it's going to wake up. So the term, the rise of China, is not really correct, I guess. If China grows its economy according to the international order, the international rules, I think it will benefit everybody. But we have little worry about it. And I think we need to sort of ask China to play the game according to the established international rules. And if it doesn't, they have to pay the cost for that. So it's different from the Cold War. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and their economy was isolated from the West. So we could contain Soviet Union. But if you look at China, most of the Asian countries have bigger trading volume with China than with United States. So we cannot isolate, we cannot contain China. We have to grow with China. So it is important to keep the international rules, international laws, and I think every country need to play the game according to the international rules. So that's why it's important to keep the WTO going. It's important to keep the Paris Accord going, and NPT or CTBT and all those things. Excuse me. And there's a INF treaty, which is now obsolete. Well, INF didn't cover China, and China could develop its own missile programs, but now they need to be part of it. I have to cover many more issues. Japan and Korea. Well, Korean Foreign Minister, Minister Khan, and I have been probably the best friends ever since we met summer 2 years ago. And we have been talking about how we can elevate our bilateral relationship to the next stage up until the Korean Supreme Court come out with its verdict almost a year ago. It's quite unfortunate that the Supreme Court of Korea came up with this verdict and everything started falling apart. The 1965 treaty is a legal foundation between Japan and Republic of Korea. So we really need to ask the Korean government to keep it as it is. Up until the Moon Jae-in government came in, the Republic of Korea sort of honored this treaty, and that was a legal foundation, and the relationship was going quite well. So we really need to go back there. I don't think it's difficult, because if we can take care of this issue, the other issue, I think it's much easier to take care of it. About 2 minutes left. Now we are talking about 3 new issues: space, cyber, and something like electromagnetics. That's the new world that we really need to pay attention to in the defense sphere. We have been hearing about Houthi drones attacking Saudi Arabia. It is much cheaper. I mean, if it is really drones, it's a lot cheaper than any type of conventional missiles. It is more difficult to detect with radar. I think Saudi Arabia need to have soldiers with rifle watching drones coming from Yemen. And now many countries are investing quite heavily in autonomous weapon system with artificial intelligence on. And you probably think about something like a Terminator. Yes, it's a most expensive way of AI weapon system. But you could create very small drones with AI on it, and you can manufacture them with much cheaper cost than any other weapons. And it's a quite striking weapons. So how are we going to deal with those new technology? That's a big issue.
Well, thank you very much, Taro-san. Clarifying question I have, Taro-san. Well, the other day, Lawrence Summers said in one conference in the following way, who will come after Mr. Trump? We are not sure. Or even he or she is a Republican or Democrat, or he or she will say the same thing. President Trump was too weak to China. This kind of comment. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I don't know if he is too weak, but definitely U.S. and China need to resolve the issues within the framework of international order. So if there's a trade war, I think they have to go back to WTO and resolve the issue within WTO. Now we have a appellate body of WTO, which only have 3 members right now, and they are going out of it December. And then WTO will not work after that. So we really need to strengthen the WTO, and we need to ask everyone to come back to WTO to solve the trade issues.
Well, thank you very much, Ano-san. Then John, I'd like to describe the European perspective on China-US relations, and also could you also mention the difficult situation of Middle East?
Well, thank you very much, Heizo, and it's a delight to be invited here by Yoshihori and the G1 conference. My footnote comment is presumably the G1 conference is ranked 1 place above the G0 conference, but I'm not going to comment further beyond that. It's a delight to be here with Kono Taro also and Meiko Nakabayashi. And of course, we are very proud that with support from the Japanese government, we are now establishing a Japan chair. We've appointed a person and will publicly announce it in 10 days or so. And of course, the Shangri-La Dialogue has been an enormous instrument for defense diplomacy in the Asia-Pacific and now the Indo-Pacific, as it is more regularly styled. And my footnote to one of the comments that the defense ministers made is that ever since, I think, 2009, Japan, Korea, and the US defense ministers have met in trilateral format at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and they did so again this year. And of course, our hope is that the Shangri-La Dialogue can still perform a platform for easy and fluid communication between defense ministers of countries, even when they have difficult or awkward relations. On China, like Kono Taro, we believe that the talk about the rise of China is slightly out of date. We talk about China's strategic arrival. It is there, and the Europeans have only just woken up strategically to China's strategic arrival. Just in the last 6 months, the European Union has developed its first genuine China strategy, at least worthy of the nomenclature strategy. And only a couple of weeks ago, NATO developed a China strategy, a very unusual step for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, for which China would be geographically out of area in the strategic parlance, but a symbol of the acceptance by both Europe and NATO that China seeks to extend its strategic foreign policy, geoeconomic reach well into Europe and indeed into the Arctic. At the IISS, I think our general view on China is that while China talks about a multipolar world, it wants a unipolar Asia. And its policy in this part of the world is one aimed at ensuring that as many countries as possible pay regular tribute to it and play by whatever rules of Chinese common law they're able to develop in the region. And of course, the challenge in this region is for all the countries to pursue what I would style a form of strategic self-determination that permits their pursuit of national policy within a collective framework. Chinese exceptionalism is now being drafted through Xi Jinping thought, so they are now developing an ideology to support their more global ambitions. Those are normally talked about in the West and in Europe through the prism of their ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, and many people talk about the way in which the Belt and Road Initiative either inspires or results in a form of debt diplomacy in the various countries in which ports and other physical infrastructure are being created. But I also think partially outdated the Western complaint about the Belt and Road Initiative, not merely because China is proving adaptive to some of the concerns and complaints of the recipients of Belt and Road generosity in Southeast Asia and in Africa, but also because the old infrastructure is not really the biggest game. It's the new infrastructure. It's the part of the Belt and Road Initiative that is styled the digital Silk Road that is a much greater challenge. There are over 80 countries in the world where China is investing in 5G, fiber optic cables, smart cities, e-governance, and the digital superpower status that China will acquire as a result of gathering the information that the MOUs with these countries normally permit will be really quite extraordinary. And so one of the things that is, of course, making the current US-China trade war particularly toxic is the subliminal and not always subliminal technological element to it. The US has, as it were, got its Sputnik moment with China now, realizing that China's growth in technology and artificial intelligence and its potential marriage of those capacities to military ability will make it a very important peer competitor to deal with. Moving to the Middle East, the discussion over the last 3 years has been principally around the decision of the United States to withdraw from the JCPOA, the so-called Iran nuclear agreement, and the consequences for arms control of that. I think one of the things that was difficult about the JCPOA is that it was never properly defined, even by the Obama administration, as simply an arms control agreement. It was nothing more or less than an arms control agreement. And the challenge and difficulty was that after July 2015, following the enormous exertions to sign the JCPOA, the US government and its European partners, and even to a degree its Gulf allies, sort of leaned back in their collective chairs, exhausted from that diplomatic activity, and were not able to develop a common strategy to deal with Iran's influence operations in the Middle East, its extracurricular activities, what Secretary Pompeo in the US might call its malign work in the region. Whereas Whereas in the past, Western countries, when they signed an arms control agreement with a challenging country, as the US regularly did with the Soviet Union, they signed an arms control agreement, they put that arms control agreement to one side, and then they developed a political, economic, and military strategy to deal with all the other issues that the opponent or challenging country posed, and that was not done with Iran. And what Iran has done is build a sovereign capability in the Middle East of influence operations, which is of co-equal importance to its nuclear program and its ballistic program. And that sovereign capability extends most dramatically into Lebanon through Hezbollah, but also has inserted itself in most of the government structures in Iraq, throughout many of the tribes in Syria, obviously in support of the Houthis in Yemen, in some of the GCC countries, also in Pakistan, where there's a large Shia community, and in Afghanistan, and extends even beyond that. And it is the influence operations that Iran organizes for itself in the Middle East that have now are now in need of a strategic response that hasn't properly been considered by the US, by the Europeans, or by the Gulf Arabs. And hence, this extraordinary scene we saw in the last 48 hours, where Saudi Arabia's most important strategic asset was attacked with a form of Iranian support still exactly to be determined. And I think the challenge we have in the West, and I will close with this point, and it's a challenge that also is faced by countries like Japan, India, in Australia, is how to deal with the influence operations of the challenger states. In Europe, the principal problem we have is the influence operations of Russia, involving itself in European elections as much as they do in the American ones. In the Middle East, it's the influence operations of Iran. And in this part of the world, it's the influence operations of China. And if statecraft is to be effective over the next 5 years, it needs to contend with that particular challenge.
Well, thank you very much, John, for your very deep analysis of this complicated issue. One question, John. How do you see the Hong Kong problem? Asian people are worrying about that very seriously. However, when I attended the World Economic Forum's board meeting last month, well, it seems to me that European people are not paying too much attention on this issue. From the viewpoint of President Xi Jinping, Hong Kong problem is more serious than Washington problem, it seems to me. I'd like to hear your opinion.
Well, I will start by saying that one of the problems that modern politicians face is that they are always recorded. So what I would recommend is everybody in this room who are interested in Hong Kong listening to the 22-minute recording of Carrie Lam's statement about 5 or 6 days ago to the Hong Kong business community, which was released by Reuters, I think, 48 hours ago. It is the most amazing, frank statement about the extraordinarily narrow room for maneuver that, as chief executive, Carrie Lam had. She acknowledged that she made a cardinal error in seeking to pass the extradition bill that was the precursor to the current round of protests, one of the now 5 issues that are being challenged by the people in Hong Kong. And what she says very frankly is that I realize that I did not completely understand the opinion of the Hong Kong people. But I have a difficulty in talking to the mainland about the opinion of the Hong Kong people when now the opinion of 1.4 billion Chinese mainlanders have been animated in objection to the effort at political self-determination that the Hong Kong demonstrations are aimed at. And she confessed that if she had a choice, she would already have resigned. But that she feels a responsibility to bring Hong Kong back to some form of normality. In the UK, there is a subdued interest about this issue because we have another domestic political problem that we're grappling with and probably will not be solved, here is a prediction, by the 31st of October. But nevertheless, we have an international responsibility over Hong Kong because of the Basic Law and the fact that that was lodged, as it were, with the United Nations. So there is some debate in the United Kingdom about this, but I think the problem will be how the business community in Hong Kong that is understandably economically wedded to mainland China finds a way to express a form of opinion about political organization in Hong Kong that finds just a little bit more favor with the mass of opinion in the younger generation in Hong Kong.
Well, thank you very much, John. Now, Miyak-san, thank you for waiting. Well, we now see a very disrupted geopolitical landscape, but almost all of them come from the United States. Or Mr. Trump's, or the fact is not so simple, I understand, but I'd like to describe the situation of the politics, also mention the presidential election. Okay?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Professor Takenaka. And President Hori, thank you very much for including me into this panel. Also, Minister Kono and Chipman-san, I am very impressed with their presentations and grasps of the current problems in this world. I actually worked in the United States, and I see so many old friends in this room, which is really nice. And even someone knows entire era of my Senate Budget Committee staffership. I worked there for many years, which means 10 years. And from inside, I observed American politics, and even still now, I am affiliated to Mansfield Foundation as a distinguished fellow. And even this month, I'm traveling to Montana, which is really a countryside of the United States. Actually, that should tell me more about American politics. President Trump is such a controversial figure. It is very difficult to describe him from Washington, D.C. only. And I see my old colleagues in Washington, D.C. very frequently, and they tell honestly about their feelings of President Trump. Mostly, although I worked for Senator Domenici, who passed away, unfortunately, 2 years ago or so. And even we got together for his farewell and so on. And the current, for example, president of World Bank is our colleague. And there are so many people who were scattered around Washington, D.C. these days. Lots of people say that President Trump is a disaster. And my former boss says, wow, I wonder whenever I wake up in the morning why I'm here in Washington without doing anything meaningful because of the president. Everybody was so disturbed with the president acts because he doesn't care about ordinary procedure of budget making, ordinary procedure of lawmaking. So many people are disturbed about that. And his way of unpredictable tweets and press conferences and so on. However, if you talk with other people in the United States, you can find vigorous supporters of President Trump. And I have a few friends like that, even in Washington, D.C. Therefore, these days, it is very difficult to describe President Trump from one direction. You have to see different kind of people. And as an observer of a long time, I can tell that American exceptionalism that dominated American foreign policy for many, many years is weakening. I'm sure about that. Also, I experienced it personally. As you can imagine, I was hired as a federal employee of U.S. Capitol Hill for 10 years, formally as a budget committee staff. it wouldn't happen these days. Look at President Trump's immigration policy. And these days, our immigration screening got much tighter. The airport control is much, much tighter. I have my green card still now, but these days it's really difficult. Sometimes I'm drawn into a separate room and being asked, why you still have this one? You don't need it because you spend so much time in Japan as a professor and so on. And I have a difficult time to defend it these days. So I don't know how long I can keep that green card. This tells the current American politics and upcoming election next year. President Trump knows the sentiment of the people. Therefore, his agenda is immigration, also economy. His stock price is really important for his next election. Therefore, I predict that he will make some kind of concession with China. Also, you have already seen that Mr. Bolton is ousted to make some deals with North Korea, Iran, maybe Afghanistan, and so on. Therefore, next election, after making those deals, just for his election, would be our stable, maybe time in terms of international relations and defense. He may win next year. That is another very adventurous, I think, 4 years to come. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for your analysis. So, well, many of my American friends are seriously criticizing Mr. Trump's policy. On the other hand, some of them are appreciating President Trump very much in the sense that he is realizing almost all promises in the election. So in that sense, politics is always very interesting. Now then, I'm saying this is the first round presentation I really appreciate, but I'd like to have a much more interactive discussion. So before that, I'd like each panelist to state what is the most optimistic scenario, what is the most pessimistic scenario. Of course, in order to avoid pessimistic scenario, in order to realize the optimistic scenario, what should we do? This is the way of discussion. And after that, the discussion open to your comments. Floor is open to your comment and question. So, Taro-san, could you, I'd like you to pick up one or two important issues. Also, describe yourself the very optimistic and pessimistic scenario.
Well, the most pessimistic scenario right now is something happens in Strait of Hormuz and get the oil supply cut down. That would send a shockwave to the global economy. I think the price of oil is already rising after this attack on Saudi facilities. So that's the most worrying scenario right now. The optimistic scenario, let me think about it. I will get back to you after 6 months.
Well, thank you very much. You are very honest in a sense. But so honestly speaking, many people are now feeling there's no way out regarding Japan-Korea relations. No way out. Both are sovereign states. Sovereign states are now competing each other, and also, well, as for the China-U.S. confrontation, this is the confrontation between American-style capitalism and the China-style state capitalism. So it's very difficult to make a concession. This kind of feeling we have. Do you have any comments on that?
I don't think it's that difficult. The Foreign Minister Khan and I have been talking about how we going to move out of this situation. We have sort of come up with at least 3-4 proposals. And if the Foreign Ministry of Korea could convince the Blue House, I think we can move out of this situation. So at least between the foreign ministries, at least at the diplomatic levels, we have already come up with several scenarios. So it's not that difficult.
Thank you very much, Taro-san. I'm very happy to hear relatively optimistic view on that issue. John?
Well, I'll make a very general pessimistic statement and then a corresponding generally optimistic one. The pessimistic one is obvious that there's no predictable rhythm to current international affairs. The disruptors carry most of the advantage. Those clinging to the status quo are losing their grip. The rules-based order is kind of deposited in the bank of Western strategic nostalgia. I noticed that people started talking about the rules-based order a few years ago when they were conscious they were about to lose it, but hadn't done much about it beforehand. My optimistic point, which corresponds to that pessimistic one, is that I think there is a prospect for Europeans, Indians, Japanese, Australians to find individual ways to champion liberal values in their own accents, and in ways consistent with their own domestic political cultures. I think one of the reasons that we are right to be pessimistic now is that the liberal order for too long by too many people was perceived through the prism of America's efforts at democracy promotion. And it was that which partly corrupted the proper development of democratic and liberal policies in difficult countries. And the proposal that I would make, given that the G1 forum is interested in concrete proposals, is that those countries I mentioned in Europe, India, Japan, Australia, in championing the liberal order, should have the following slogan as their mantra. And the slogan would be that good governance without democracy is safer strategically than is democracy without good governance. And that therefore the purpose of those today wishing to champion liberal values with the goal of succeeding is to emphasize not democracy, which is seen in too many other cultures as a pernicious slogan, but to champion and promote good governance. And if good governance is installed, then organically from within, the prospects of democratic accountability can properly develop.
John, could you mention a little bit more about the Japan's role? What for Japan, what we should do?
Well, I think what we from the outside have seen in the last 5 or 6 years, and I'm repeating myself here, is essentially a process of Japanese strategic self-determination. In the 1950s and the 1960s, the word self-determination was associated with the countries decolonizing themselves and developing their own individual political sovereignty. But in the last few years, we've seen a number of countries, a number of geographies, essentially developing strategic self-determination, which is deciding that they for themselves can develop what their national priorities are and confect a strategy with allies and friends and partners to advance that national purpose, where it can be blended in institutions and otherwise in networks. And Japan is a very highly networked society, and its foreign policy and diplomacy, I think, will be developed as much through networks of contacts as through the precise institutions and organizations of which it is a member. We live in a time of a very fluid diplomacy, and so containing your diplomacy to the formal institutions of international governance, whether it be the ASEAN Regional Forum or more globally the G20, will be insufficient. You have to, I think, guide your national purpose through a number of other networks of international associations, and I have the sense that is what Japanese foreign policy has been much about in the last few years and will continue to be.
Taro-san, you have some comments on John's John's statement?
About democracy and good governance. When I was going to school, if a country grows economically, then the people will demand a democracy in the next stage. But we have not really seen that recently. I still believe that if you have real capitalism, real market economy, and if the country grows economy within real market economy, I think the newly created middle class would demand democracy in the next step. But if a country start developing its economy within so-called state capitalism, why would you want to bring in a free election which might lead to the change of the government, which is a source of your profit? So we have to be very careful what kind of capitalism you will bring in. We still have to help those countries to play within a real capitalism, real market economy. And then hopefully the next step, they will go democratic. So we have been seeing sort of a state capitalism in many places and pretending that they have a real capitalism and real democracy. I think that's something we need to pay attention to.
According to the estimate by the UNCTAD, well, in the past 2 years or so, more than 100 countries, more than 100 countries, the role of the government was strengthened. This is the influence of the state capitalism of China, in a sense. But anyway, free market is very important, and at the same time, in gathering big data, state capitalism of China is showing a very strong power. So we have to pay very special attention on that. This is a reason why in the Davos meeting in January, Prime Minister Abe mentioned free data free flow with trust, Well, this is a very important topic to be discussed in the offline section, I believe. So thank you for waiting, Hemik-san. What is your most optimistic scenario and pessimistic scenario? Well, the United States American role is very important. Well, appreciate your opinion.
Thank you very much. I should be concise. Well, optimistic scenario is going to be President Trump and his administration behave much more decently toward the election next year. However, it is very difficult to expect. However, also as an optimistic scenario, maybe next president is going to be a very decent internationalist president. However, it could be difficult. My colleagues in Republican side are saying that if Mr. Biden is chosen by Democratic supporters, they even would support that candidate instead of President Trump. I was really surprised, shocked to hear that, because that is a private conversation. They cannot say that openly. However, we are not sure whether Mr. Biden is going to be chosen by Democratic colleagues, and could be Ms. Warren. She could be also difficult ones for a Republican side to support because she's pretty liberal. Therefore, in that case, President Trump might be able to win, and of course, Rust Belt and Corn Belt people are very important for that election. In pessimistic scenario, of course, even if President Trump is not elected, the United States might have been changing permanently and not coming back as it is, as we know. And internationalism, globalism is going to be fading away. That is very pessimistic. And in that case, Japan and Europe, all Asian countries have to really determine to kind of make up their mind to play more important roles, because there isn't any international leader to strongly face China and keep our democracy in a healthy way. That is a very pessimistic and difficult scenario, but it could be very possible.
Thank you for waiting. The floor is open to your comment questions. I'd like you, well, so many hands. I'd like you to identify yourself, name and belonging, if possible. The first person, the lady over here.
Thanks so much for that excellent panel. My name is Lynn Kwok, and I'm from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, where Dr. Chipman has helmed for many years now to great regard. My question is directed to Minister Taro Kono. It's very nice to see you again. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. I think it's quite trite to say by now that for the region, economics is security. And this integral link between economics and security has been recognized by various countries, including the United States. The former defense minister of the United States actually spoke about this link at the Shangri-La Dialogue earlier this year. Unfortunately, US actions have fallen a bit short. Its BUILD Act hasn't had concrete results, nor has its trilateral partnership with Japan and Australia for infrastructure development. What would you, as Defense Minister, be seeking to promote by way of economic initiatives so as to better increase Japan's ability to promote a rules-based order in the region? And in this respect, I understand that Japan's
Could you raise short questions, please?
Japan's investment in infrastructure far outstrips China, though China is stepping up. Do you think it would help to increase Japan's visibility in terms of what it's doing in this respect? Thank you.
I don't think we are going to compete against China in infrastructure project. Actually, if you want to build a road or easy bridge or all those infrastructure, it's much cheaper to have Chinese company doing it. Well, the quality set aside. I think what's important is the quality infrastructure, which we have been promoting. We need to warn those recipient country about its openness, transparency, or life cycle economy, and most importantly, sustainability of debt service. So many infrastructure projects were not economically feasible, and they borrowed too much. And it's okay for the government to borrow so much money and do big infrastructure to win the next election. And many governments are not worried about 20 years, 30 years from now. And that's something we need to raise awareness. So that's what we are trying to do with US, Australia, and other like-minded countries.
Well, thank you very much. Considering the time constraint, I'd like to raise 2 or 3 questions. Gentleman over here, and Elsa-san, and gentleman over here. Okay, 3 questions. I'm sorry for that, okay?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Excellent panel. My question is for His Excellency, Mr. Kono. You just described the disruption of oil flow from the Strait of Hormuz as Japan's worst nightmare. What is Japan, in your capacity of defense minister, what is Japan prepared to do to protect itself from this worst nightmare, considering that 40% of oil comes from, Japan's oil comes from Saudi Arabia, and that you have excellent ties with Iran at the same time?
Okay, thank you. That's
Terzal from METI. A question to Dr. Chipman. You mentioned the Chinese ambition is to develop a unipolar system led by China. How should we be dealing with such an ambition by China? And what are the leverages we have to make sure that China will play by the international rule or become a responsible player? The economic influence of other countries, including Japan, is relatively being reduced vis-a-vis China, and the power of international rule is being weakened by the U.S. not respecting the international rule. So how should we be dealing, and what are the leverages? Thank you.
Okay, last question over here. The gentleman who raised a hand. No, okay. Okay, gentleman over here, yes.
Thank you. Martin Newman from the Leadership Council in London. We've had, where quite a way through our plenary session on sustainable innovation. No one has talked about environment. No one has talked about climate crisis. It's apparent to many that this is the biggest challenge facing us. We're not talking about it. We also have an opportunity by addressing this through innovation to actually partner and show leadership. What are we doing and why aren't we talking about it?
Thank you very much for raising a very important point. Okay, the first question to Taro-san and John, and also I'd like you to mention a little bit about environment SDGs, okay?
Yes, about issue in the Middle East, I think we definitely need to ease the tension between among those countries. And well, as a foreign minister, the last thing I was doing was calling Iranian foreign minister, calling French foreign minister to ease the tension in the region through diplomatic actions. And I think it's important to continue doing it. And this Houthi attack on Saudi is a little different. It's a terrorist attack. And I think we might be requiring some kind of military operation against those drone attacks. And that's something out of Japan's constitutional boundary. So I think Japan will be focusing on diplomatic effort in easing tension in the region.
Well, first on a unipolar China, rather than develop in 60 seconds a general strategy for how one deals with a unipolar China or one that has that ambitions, let me make a very specific recommendation for this particular region, which is to at least stay ahead of the curve. So over the last 3 or 4 years, the main preoccupation has been the way in which China has inveigled itself in the South China Sea and built up facilities that have military significance in its islands and features in the South China Sea that it claims is its own. At least be one step ahead. The next step is to be concerned about the small island states in the South Pacific. And you will have seen that the new Australian government of Scott Morrison and his Foreign Minister Maurice Payne never let 2 weeks go by without going to the South Pacific. And I'm certain that Japan, with its friends in Australia and other countries, might take the view that it's important to direct some of its economic diplomacy also to the South Pacific countries. One small statistic, the last Australian defense minister said that if by some chance China gained virtual sovereignty over one of the South Pacific island states like Fiji, it would immediately lead to a 2% rise in GDP of the Australian defense budget. So my advice is to be at least one step ahead of the curve. On climate security, we at the IISS, since at least 2001, 2002, have developed a large program on climate change and security and looked at the very different effects that climate change has on security in different parts of the region. I think one of the surprising addresses to which climate security concerns can effectively be sent is the US Pentagon. When we started this program in 2002, one of the people most interested in it was Don Rumsfeld, the then Secretary of Defense, who you wouldn't necessarily consider would be an automatic advocate of climate security issues. But the Pentagon is very aware that it's one of the top 10 users of fossil fuels in the world, and that America's security is very tied up with how climate change will affect local and regional security questions. So there, my recommendation is, given the very great difficulty of achieving international treaties or compliance with those on a global level, is for businesses and cities, as they have done, to continue to take the lead in trying to drive the new climate change policies that are required to avoid the very great difficulties that we're now on trend to have.
Thank you. Mexa, you have comments?
Very shortly. Actually, in the United States, Rumsfeld and Bolton, those people are defense internationalists. So there is no wonder they showed their agreement about climate change and climate security. However, during the Trump administration, it might be very difficult to convince them. But at the same time, we have to have China and the United States into this agreement. Otherwise, our Earth cannot be saved. In that sense, we should look at states like California and others that are more progressive. In that sense, American people are not that same as President Trump. Therefore, we should really approach locally, maybe, and then we can bring them into international agreement. And for China, the government is very strong, so somehow we have to be strategic to draw them into our international community.
Well, thank you very much. Since this climate change is a very important issue, as was mentioned by him, well, Kono-san, could you also mention a little bit about this? In my understanding, Ministry of Foreign Affairs was in charge of developing the idea of the SDGs of the United Nations. So maybe you have been involved in, as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, in this kind of issue.
I used to be Minister for Disaster Management, and a lot of people talk about earthquake, but actually the biggest risk we are facing is a flood in Tokyo. We almost came so close. Not many people know about it, but if there's a flood in Tokyo, at least 2 million people strangled, and the subway system will be down for many months. So we really vulnerable. We often talk about the small island countries, but probably Tokyo is more vulnerable than that. So we really need to put the priority on climate change high on agenda. And well, yes, it's China, it's United States, it's India, but we just cannot blame it on someone else. We have to do what we can do. And if we can go through innovation, we can apply those technology to others. So we really need to elevate the climate change agenda very high. The first thing I'm doing as a defense minister is actually coordinating self-defense force and TEPCO to recover those people in Chiba who lost their electricity. So the climate change is a serious issue, and everyone now feel about it. So we really need to put more resource into this.
Well, thank you very, very much. Only 4 minutes left, so in the very final stage, I'd like each panelist to give some concluding remarks. Well, what Japan, especially Japanese government, should do, what Japanese leading companies should do. The other day, as you know, the cabinet reshuffling was made. What do you expect of the new government? Miyake-san, could you kick off them? 1 minute. Okay.
Okay, I think Japan has a capacity to become a leader in this very chaotic and changing world. And Minister Kono is one of the young leaders. And we need to have younger leaders to bring new ideas and new network that they already developed in this world. And climate change and other like United Nations agendas could be well introduced into Japan, and we can really become the agenda leader and participating in this kind of meetings very frequently and including leaders from political field would be very important. Japan can be a leader.
Thank you very much. John?
Thank you very much. Well, I wrote an article a couple of years ago for the Harvard Business Review that was provocatively titled, "Why Your Company Needs a Foreign Policy." And my argument then is still one I hold to now, that foreign policy is, to coin a phrase from the early 20th century, too important an issue to be left to foreign ministries alone. And whereas the normal role of businesses over the last 50 years have been to engage in good corporate social responsibility policies and maintain their political neutrality, while political neutrality is a form of foreign policy, it's insufficient today. Just look at the dramas that Cathay Pacific had over the last few weeks in Hong Kong, because its CEO and chair had not thought through how it should comport itself, given the known risk that there would be Hong Kong demonstrations and that some of its own employees would be engaged in it. Look at how many difficulties, again, focusing on China, that a number of companies had because of the way in which they portray Taiwan on their maps or the way in which they refer to it. So unless companies develop their own foreign policies, they won't be able to secure their economic interests internationally. Neutrality won't be enough anymore.
Thank you. Finally, Taro-san.
It used to be the Middle East was core interest of the United States, and Japan, as with a U.S. basis, was important place for deployment. With shale gas coming up, the importance of Middle East in U.S. is going down, and it would affect U.S.-Japan alliance, or we shouldn't let that happen. So we need to come up with new values for the alliance, and we need to make sure that Washington understands the importance of U.S.-Japan alliance to keep it going. For many years to come, I think the cornerstone of stability and peace in East Asia is the U.S.-Japan alliance, and we understand its value, and we need to keep it as it is. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much for excellent discussions. Well, I believe I'm an economist, not a security specialist, but very regrettably now, many countries, many governments are taking policies that worsen the economy. That's my worry. But anyway, we have been living in the liberal world order after the Second World War. Liberal order means free trade and globalism and multilateralism, protectional environment, etc., etc. And the rule maker was the United States. However, now rule maker is disappearing. That's a regret. But at the same time, Japan cannot be a rule maker, but Japan could be a rule shaper. Rule shaper, that must be a very important role for the Japanese government, the Japan, I think. Well, for example, after the United States left the TPP, we concluded the TPP 11, and Kono-san concluded the free trade agreement with the EU. EU-Japan economic agreement covered 30% of GDP and 40% of trade, world trade. So, global rule shaper could be a very important Japanese role, I believe. Anyway, thank you very much, and please give very big hand to excellent panelists.